Morning everybody. I've overcome my first challenge of getting up on that big giant step, so hopefully the rest will go smoothly. I suspect that much of what I will say will frustrate and maybe annoy you a little bit, but having made a career out of frustrating and annoying people, I figure why change now? But I think the reason for that really is because I think when we discuss these issues, we often raise more questions and issues than we yet have solutions for. But I think days like today and the ongoing work that has led up to this and will go on beyond are about trying to solve some of those challenges and issues. We're looking beyond diagnosis. It's important, first of all, to say that, of course, assessment for diagnosis and diagnosis itself is extremely important, not least because we've heard from people in the film and from people we engage with every day about how it goes to enabling people to understand themselves, their sense of identity, often a sense of relief, that an explanation for why they might have had struggles or challenges or felt, out of place. So it's extremely important. But I was very struck by what Scott said about being left to it. It's a fairly complicated topic. In a past life, I taught on a modular master's in autism, and if we require a master's degree to understand autism, then surely people who have autism require some support and enabling advice to make sense of their own lives in the context of this news. So that's a given, but autism, as we know, is lifelong. So we need to really know what it is we need to do across that life journey to enable people with autism themselves have to have some understanding of themselves to be able to manage their lives and manage their circumstances effectively, and to have a sense of control over their lives and some self-understanding. So in the context of this, I'm going to talk about the purpose of assessment, but first of all, I think it's really important to say that it's important for any assessment to be relevant, purposeful and proportionate. I think there will be numbers of people in the room who will have lots and lots of paper about them and around them, but really feeling sometimes that it's put to very little use. So the sort of idea that it has to be an acceptable and purposeful level of assessment, I think, is really, really crucial, and not just for its sake. The ticky box paper exercise isn't any use to anybody, and certainly just only serves to diminish the rainforest somewhat. So what is an acceptable level of assessment, and also the involvement and engagement of people with autism in assessment, I think is extremely important. I think it's also important to say that if people are carrying out assessments, people should reasonably expect that something would come of it, and I know that that isn't always the case. But in terms of why we might undertake assessment, there are all these reasons that I've listed here, and probably some more. But when you look at that, that then leads us to realise that there are a startling array of professionals and people who are potentially involved in assessment. So the big question for me is, how up to the job are we really in terms of conducting proper and detailed assessments around things like identifying people's needs, understanding and selecting appropriate teaching and learning methods. And something that's becoming more and more important in the pressure as a specialist service provider, we are increasingly asked, well, what makes you so special? What is so special about you? And so having to evidence progress and development. And you can do that in lots of ways, but we have to consider are there sort of standardised, concrete ways we can do that, and that's always a challenge when we deal with the heterogeneity of the spectrum. So in terms of the assessment process, there are a number of areas that are of potential relevance. Some of those you will recognise as being at the core of autism. Some of those are relevant for people with other conditions, and indeed people who are typically developing. But in actual fact, you need a hefty degree of knowledge to understand what you're looking at. Quite interestingly, I was at a presentation recently where someone was advocating that what we should be looking at is how happy people are, measuring happiness. And not only does that appeal to the old hippie in me, but it goes to my fundamental belief that if people feel well, they behave well, they live well. And so I think we do need to focus on issues like well-being, quality of life and happiness. And they might sound quite tangential and quite subjective, but really, so what? They are still important. So these are core because if we're going to enable people to develop the skills and strategies that they need to sustain a good life and a healthy life, we really need to be able to understand the impact of all these elements and, more importantly, understand what they mean and what the response should be. In terms of the challenge, there are a number of things we have to think about. The tools that we have, the reliability of those, accessibility and training and cost. The number of tools we have are legion. There are, as we say in Scotland, hundreds of them, but they don't always do the job that we want them to do. They're not always designed with people with autism in mind. They're extremely generic. So there's a question mark about the tools that are at our disposal. There's a huge issue around reliability. They're often designed with a very small subgroup of people in mind, if you want to put it that way. And also the issue of fidelity, of how we use these tools, how we apply them, how we understand them. The whole issue of involving people with autism in assessment, I think, is crucial, and therefore real-world assessment, real-life assessment, rather than very clinical approaches to assessment, are extremely important. I'm going to speak a bit more about cost in a minute, but I think when we're in a climate of austerity, as John rehearsed early on, it's quite important that we spend our money wisely, but also if we are going to evidence our specialism, if you like, it's very difficult to do that when services are being capped in terms of prices that people will pay per hour, but yet the expectation is that we will deliver these highly specialist services. So just a quick look at how challenging it is in terms of the tools. In Scottish Autism, we commissioned Ken Aitken, who's well known in Scotland, I'm sure he is around the world as well, to look at tools and processes around assessment for us. He reviewed, I can't go into detail of how complicated this all was, but he looked at 63 different tools and techniques. This took him to reference over 500 academic articles to do that, so you can see how complex it is. 63% of those required a degree of training or were restricted to a specific professional discipline. I go back to my point about capping hourly rates of services. It's very difficult to use some of these tools in that context. And some of them were free of charge, but some cost up to over £1,000 with ongoing costs for scorecards, materials, booklets, that kind of thing. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with what we've got, our knowledge and experience of people with autism. And we have to use that on the ground every day in our autism services. We have to have people who know. People need to know and understand autism. They need to be able to interpret. And I was very struck by Scott's story about his dear friend and losing him and setting fire to the chair, and how easily that could have been so misunderstood, and that very, what felt to me quite a clear communication of an emotion could easily have been misinterpreted. And so we need people who know about autism. In health, the health arena, that specialist service model is prized. I don't know anybody, I would defy anyone in the room who had a heart problem to be happy to go to someone who did 2.5 hours awareness raising on the functioning of the heart. You just wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it, but we ask people with autism to tolerate that day in and day out, and it's not acceptable. So what can we do? We need to pull our own knowledge, and we have to be careful that we're not eroding specialism because of this climate that we're in. We have to somehow hang on to that. So in summary, what I'd like to say, and I'll share a little bit also because the red card is coming any minute now. I think there has, in Scotland certainly, there has been a strategic focus on diagnosis. But there's a real need for that specialism in diagnosis, but also what is coming next, what can we do next? And we need to be able to assess and have confidence in that assessment. And some of the things that we're doing in our own organisation, we've employed a researcher in residence to work on a programme of practitioner researcher training so that our own staff can be skilled to understand what it is they're doing that is effective for individuals. But that post is funded by the kindness of philanthropists, trusts, charitable giving, and that's the landscape we're in. You know, that's core. Understanding what we do and how it works, why it's effective, and sharing that is core. Yet we have to rely on the kindness of strangers, really, to do that for us. Partnerships with academia, I think, are really, really important. I was struck by this idea of the link between assessment and being, evidence-based. I had the good fortune to go to the European conference the other weekend, and I went to a presentation on being evidence-based. And I can tell you now, if we took the approach that they had taken, we'd be bankrupt in 6 months. It was extremely intensive, extremely resource intensive to do the things that we're doing. But academia is an open door now. Academics are looking for relationships with organisations, so we need to make more of that. A final point I'd make is that we also are looking at initiatives for what we call knowledge management, the sharing of our autism knowledge, the translation of our autism knowledge, and we see that working on a organisational level. There's a real need for that sharing and knowledge translation at a national level. I'm involved in the Scottish Government's Autism Reference Group, and through the job that I do as lead on the Best Value Group, I found a lovely paper that Scotland has a knowledge management strategy. I have more chance of finding ShareGuard than I do of finding the person who originated this policy and anybody who's doing anything about it. But I think we have a real opportunity to join the dots, to share our knowledge and to get things better in the arena of service delivery by understanding the needs of people more fully. So that's me.